The coffee was still warm when Sarah Chen disappeared. On February 14th, 2003, in the farming community of Millbrook, Michigan, population 847, Valentine's Day arrived with a blizzard that would dump 14 inches of snow across Gratiot County. At 9:47 p.m., Sarah's neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, had waved goodbye through her kitchen window as the 23-year-old nursing student carried a steaming mug across the narrow strip of yard that separated their modest ranch houses. Sarah was returning the ceramic mug she'd borrowed earlier that evening, the same blue and white checkered pattern that Mrs. Vance had owned for 30 years. The elderly woman watched Sarah's silhouette disappear into the swirling snow, her red winter coat the last splash of color against the white darkness. What happened in the next 47 minutes would haunt Millbrook for the next 2 decades. Sarah's boyfriend, Derek Martinez, called the Gratiot County Sheriff's Department at 10:34 p.m., his voice cracking as he reported that Sarah had simply vanished. He'd been waiting for her to return from next door, he explained to Deputy Wallace, becoming increasingly worried as the storm intensified. When he finally trudged through the knee-deep snow to Mrs. Vance's house, she told him Sarah had left nearly an hour earlier. Derek had immediately run back to their shared rental house, calling her name, searching every room, every closet, even the basement crawl space where they stored Christmas decorations and old textbooks. The front door was locked from the inside. The deadbolt Sarah had insisted they install after a rash of break-ins the previous summer was engaged. The back door remained secured with the chain lock still in place. Every window was latched tight against the February cold, their aging frames sealed with the plastic sheeting Derek had carefully installed in November. Sarah's purse sat on the kitchen counter, her keys beside it, her cell phone plugged into its charger in the bedroom. Her nursing school textbooks were spread across the dining room table exactly as she'd left them, yellow highlighter still uncapped beside a half-completed anatomy assignment due the following Monday. Mrs. Vance provided the only timeline. She'd made hot chocolate while Sarah borrowed the mug. They'd chatted briefly about the storm, and Sarah had mentioned being excited about Valentine's Day plans with Derek. The young woman had seemed perfectly normal, maybe a little tired from her clinical rotations at the county hospital, but nothing that suggested fear or distress. Mrs. Vance estimated their conversation lasted no more than 15 minutes. Sarah had pulled her red coat tight against the wind and stepped into a night that would swallow her completely. Deputy Wallace, a 22-year veteran of rural policing, had seen plenty of domestic disputes, missing persons reports filed in anger, and young people who disappeared after fights with family. But standing in Sarah's living room at 11:15 p.m., watching Derek pace frantically while snow continued to batter the windows, he felt something different. The house held an eerie stillness, as if it was holding its breath. Sarah's presence lingered everywhere, her coffee mug in the sink, her nursing scrubs draped over a chair, her vanilla-scented candles still burning on the mantel. Yet she was gone, impossibly gone, from a locked house in a town where everyone knew everyone, on a night when the blizzard had driven even the most dedicated bar patrons home hours early. The deputy began what would become the most frustrating investigation of his career, not knowing that the truth lay buried deeper than the snow outside, waiting 20 years to surface in a revelation that would shatter everything this quiet farming community believed about trust, safety, and the people they thought they knew. Sarah Chen's mother, Linda Chen, received the call at 6:23 a.m. on February 15th. She was preparing for her early shift at the Ford plant in Lansing, mechanically spooning instant coffee into her travel mug, while morning news droned from the small television perched on her kitchen counter. Derek's voice, raw from hours of crying and calling Sarah's name into the storm, barely managed to form the words that would reshape Linda's world. Her daughter, her only child, the girl who called every Sunday without fail and sent flowers on Mother's Day from whatever clinical rotation site she happened to be working, had vanished from a locked house in the middle of a blizzard. Linda's first instinct was denial. Sarah was responsible, predictable, the kind of young woman who color-coded her class schedules and never missed an appointment. She'd overcome so much already. Growing up as one of the few Asian American children in rural Michigan, losing her father to a factory accident when she was 16, working 2 jobs to pay for nursing school. Sarah didn't just disappear. Sarah didn't break promises or abandon responsibilities or leave people wondering where she was. But as Linda drove the 87 miles from her apartment in Lansing to Millbrook, slipping and sliding on roads that the county plows hadn't yet cleared, she felt a cold certainty settling in her chest that had nothing to do with the February weather. By noon, Linda had transformed Sarah's rental house into a command center. She pushed Derek's gaming chair aside and spread maps of Gratiot County across the dining room table, marking potential search areas with red ink. She called in sick for the first time in 3 years, then called her supervisor back to explain she might need extended leave. Linda had learned long ago, watching her husband die slowly in a hospital bed while insurance companies argued over coverage, that the system rarely fought for people like them. If Sarah was going to be found, it would be because someone who loved her refused to stop looking. The investigation's early days revealed the fault lines that would define the next 2 decades. Detective Raymond "Ray" Morrison, a 28-year veteran who transferred to Gratiot County for the quieter pace after a career in Detroit homicide, approached Sarah's disappearance with methodical skepticism. Young women didn't vanish from locked houses, he explained to Linda during their first meeting. Young women had fights with boyfriends, made impulsive decisions, sometimes needed space to think. The locked doors could be explained. Maybe Derek was lying. Maybe Sarah had a key hidden somewhere. Maybe she'd slipped out a window and pulled it shut behind her. Morrison ordered searches of the immediate area, questioned Derek extensively, and waited for Sarah to call home. Linda's faith in official channels began cracking during that first week. Morrison seemed more interested in Derek's financial troubles and their occasional arguments than in the physical impossibility of Sarah's disappearance. When Linda suggested expanding the search area, Morrison reminded her about limited resources and the reality of winter weather. When she pushed for more aggressive questioning of neighbors, he cited proper procedure and the need for evidence. When she begged for media attention that might generate leads, Morrison worried about compromising the investigation. Linda realized she was fighting 2 battles, finding Sarah and forcing the system to care enough to help. The community response split along similar lines. Sarah's nursing school classmates organized weekend search parties, trudging through snowdrifts and abandoned farmland with the desperate energy of youth confronting mortality. Local churches provided meals and prayer circles, but others whispered different theories. Some wondered about Derek's story, noting his gambling problems and the couple's recent financial stress. Others suggested Sarah might have staged her own disappearance, overwhelmed by school pressures and family expectations. The whispers grew louder when Derek moved back to his parents' house in Grand Rapids after 3 weeks, unable to afford the rent alone and haunted by the silence that had replaced Sarah's laughter. Linda rented a small apartment in Millbrook, determined to maintain a base of operations even as her savings dwindled. She spent mornings canvassing neighborhoods that detectives had already visited, afternoons photocopying missing person flyers at the library, and evenings calling police departments in neighboring counties. Sleep became elusive, food became optional, and every phone call carried the potential to either save or destroy what remained of her world. Linda developed an obsession with details that others dismissed as irrelevant. The exact temperature that night, the precise timeline of Mrs. Vance's testimony, the logistics of Derek's story, the significance of Sarah's abandoned coffee. As February melted into March and search parties dwindled to a handful of die-hard volunteers, Linda began to understand that she was fighting alone, sustained only by a mother's refusal to accept the unacceptable. Millbrook had the kind of secrets that small towns cultivate like prize-winning tomatoes, carefully tended, selectively shared, and fiercely protected from outsiders. When Sarah Chen disappeared, those secrets didn't emerge all at once. Instead, they seeped out gradually like water through limestone, each revelation adding another layer of complexity to an already impossible case. The Chen investigation exposed fractures in the community that most residents preferred to ignore. At Rosie's Diner, the morning coffee crowd that had gathered religiously for 15 years suddenly found themselves choosing sides. Earl Patterson, who'd lived in Millbrook since 1967 and knew every family's business going back 3 generations, insisted that Derek Martinez had always seemed shifty. Something about the way he looked at people, Earl claimed, stirring sugar into his coffee with unnecessary force. But Dolores McKnight, who taught Sunday school at First Baptist and had watched Derek help elderly parishioners with their groceries, defended the young man with surprising vehemence. Their debates grew heated enough that Rosie herself had to institute a "No Sarah talk" during breakfast rush policy by the end of March. The investigation revealed uncomfortable truths about law enforcement resources in rural Michigan. Gratiot County maintained a force of 12 full-time deputies covering 571 square miles of farmland, small towns, and scattered homesteads. Detective Morrison found himself juggling Sarah's case alongside a methamphetamine lab bust near Alma, a domestic violence situation that required weekly check-ins and the ongoing investigation of equipment thefts from local farms. The state police offered assistance, but their involvement meant ceding control of the investigation to Lansing, something Morrison's pride wouldn't allow. Linda Chen's persistent phone calls and unscheduled visits to the sheriff's department became a source of frustration rather than motivation. Deputies began timing their lunch breaks to avoid her daily 11:30 a.m. appearances, clutching new theories printed from internet crime forums. Sarah's disappearance also illuminated the complex social dynamics of a community caught between agricultural tradition and suburban encroachment. The original families, the Pattersons, the Vances, the Kowalskis, who'd farmed the same land for 4 generations, viewed newer residents with polite suspicion. Derek, despite living in Millbrook for 3 years, remained an outsider from Grand Rapids whose family had never worked the land. Sarah occupied an even more complicated position as a nursing student, whose ambitions clearly extended beyond the county line. Some long-time residents whispered that maybe she'd simply decided small-town life wasn't for her, that the locked doors and mysterious circumstances were elaborate staging designed to avoid hurting Derek's feelings. The investigation exposed other uncomfortable realities. Several residents admitted to police that they routinely left doors unlocked, despite the recent break-ins that had prompted Sarah to install her deadbolt. Mrs. Vance revealed that she'd noticed unfamiliar vehicles parked along County Road 21 several times in January, but hadn't thought to write down license numbers or descriptions. The volunteer fire department's search and rescue training consisted primarily of finding lost hunters during deer season, not conducting systematic searches for missing persons in winter conditions. These admissions embarrassed a community that prided itself on self-sufficiency and looking out for neighbors. Most disturbing were the details that emerged about Sarah's final weeks. Classmates from her nursing program revealed that she'd seemed increasingly anxious about something she wouldn't discuss. Her supervisor at the county hospital mentioned that Sarah had asked several unusual questions about patient confidentiality and reporting requirements. 3 different residents recalled seeing Sarah having what appeared to be an intense conversation with someone in the parking lot outside Millbrook Market during the first week of February, but no one could identify the other person or recall specific details about what they'd witnessed. The town's response to media attention further revealed its protective instincts. When a television crew from Lansing arrived in early March to film a segment about Sarah's disappearance, many residents suddenly became unavailable for interviews. Store owners claimed to be too busy to talk. Neighbors developed selective amnesia about timeline details they'd freely shared with police. The reporter, frustrated by the wall of silence, characterized Millbrook as a community more interested in protecting its reputation than finding a missing young woman. The broadcast aired during the dinner hour on a Tuesday evening, ensuring that everyone in town watched their neighbors' faces as carefully as they listened to the reporter's words, looking for signs of betrayal or secrets finally exposed. The crime scene photographs from February 15, 2003, captured a world transformed by winter's violence. Deputy Wallace had arrived at Sarah Chen's rental house just after sunrise, his department-issued camera producing stark black-and-white images that would be scrutinized for decades. The blizzard had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind an eerily pristine landscape where every footprint, every disturbance, every anomaly stood out against the unmarked snow, like evidence written in a language investigators couldn't yet read. The photographic record began with the house itself, a modest single-story ranch typical of 1970s construction, its brown aluminum siding and narrow windows giving it the anonymous appearance of temporary housing. Snow had drifted against the north wall, reaching nearly to the windowsills, while the wind had scoured the south side almost clean. Wallace documented every angle, every door, every possible entry point. The front door showed no signs of forced entry, its steel frame intact and deadbolt functioning normally. The back door revealed the same story. Secure, undisturbed, the chain lock still engaged exactly as Derek had found it. Windows remained latched from the inside, their ancient mechanisms stiff with cold and paint, but clearly undamaged. The most crucial evidence lay in the snow itself, though its significance wouldn't be fully understood for years. Wallace methodically photographed every set of tracks in the immediate vicinity of the house. Derek's size 11 boots had left deep impressions between his car and the front door, with additional tracks showing his panicked search around the building's perimeter when he realized Sarah was missing. Mrs. Vance's smaller footprints created a neat path between her kitchen door and the property line where she'd handed Sarah the borrowed mug. But Sarah's tracks told a different story entirely. Her footprints, clearly defined in the fresh snow, showed her journey from Mrs. Vance's house toward her own front door. The impressions were consistent with her size 7 winter boots, the treads leaving distinctive waffle patterns that Derek immediately recognized. Forensic photography captured each step in precise detail, measuring stride length and depth, documenting the way her right foot turned slightly outward due to an old ankle injury from high school basketball. But approximately 15 feet from her front door, Sarah's tracks simply stopped. Not faded, not obscured by wind, but ended completely, as if she'd been lifted straight up into the storm-darkened sky. Crime scene technicians from the state police arrived on February 16th, with equipment better suited to urban investigations than rural Michigan winters. They collected snow samples from the area where Sarah's tracks ended, hoping to find some trace evidence that might explain the impossibility of her disappearance. The samples were carefully preserved and shipped to the state laboratory in Lansing, where technicians would search for hair fibers, fabric fragments, or chemical traces that might provide clues. The results, delivered 3 weeks later, revealed nothing but frozen precipitation and trace minerals consistent with agricultural runoff. More sophisticated analysis focused on the snow itself as a timeline. Meteorological records showed that the blizzard had intensified around 9 p.m. on February 14th, with heavy snowfall continuing until approximately 3 a.m. on the 15th. The accumulation rate meant that any tracks made earlier in the evening would have been partially or completely obscured by morning. Yet Sarah's footprints remained clearly visible, indicating they'd been made during the final hours of the storm. This timing corroborated Mrs. Vance's testimony about when Sarah had left her house, but it made the mystery of her disappearance even more profound. Inside the rental house, evidence collection revealed the eerie normalcy of a life interrupted mid-sentence. Sarah's anatomy textbook lay open to a chapter on cardiovascular system disorders, her handwritten notes filling the margins in her characteristic precise script. A half-eaten bowl of tomato soup sat cooling on the kitchen counter, the spoon still resting against its ceramic rim. Her cell phone showed no unusual activity, no calls, no text messages, no internet searches that might hint at plans or concerns. The last entry in her daily planner, written in blue ink that hadn't yet dried, simply read, "V-Day dinner with D, excited." Forensic examination of the house's interior produced results that were simultaneously thorough and frustrating. Fingerprint analysis revealed exactly what investigators expected: Sarah's prints throughout the residence, Derek's in common areas and the bedroom they shared, and a few additional prints belonging to landlord maintenance personnel. No signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry or violent encounter, no indication that anything unusual had occurred inside the house. The scene suggested that Sarah had simply walked outside and vanished, leaving behind a perfectly preserved tableau of domestic normalcy. The physical evidence from February 2003 would be catalogued, analyzed and stored in the Gratiot County Sheriff's Department evidence room, where it would remain largely untouched for nearly 2 decades, waiting for technology and perspective that didn't yet exist to unlock its secrets. The first break in Sarah Chen's case came 11 days after her disappearance, when a convenience store clerk in Bay City called the tip line to report a young Asian woman matching Sarah's description. The woman had purchased coffee and gasoline around midnight on February 15th, the clerk explained, and she'd seemed nervous, checking over her shoulder repeatedly while counting out exact change. Detective Morrison drove the 130 miles to Bay City, with Linda Chen riding silently in the passenger seat, both of them afraid to hope too loudly. The surveillance footage from the gas station showed a woman of approximately Sarah's height and build, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, similar to how Sarah typically wore hers. But when the clerk viewed the video alongside Morrison and Linda, his certainty crumbled. The woman's face remained obscured by the camera angle and poor lighting. Her coat was navy blue rather than red, and her mannerisms didn't match the nervous energy he'd described. Linda stared at the grainy footage until her eyes watered, willing it to be her daughter, but deep in her chest she knew the truth before Morrison spoke it aloud. This wasn't Sarah. This was just another woman, living her own life, unaware that her late-night gas purchase had briefly carried the hopes of a desperate mother. The Bay City lead established a pattern that would repeat dozens of times over the following months. A waitress in Flint reported serving someone who looked like Sarah. A bus driver in Detroit remembered a quiet passenger who'd paid with exact change and avoided eye contact. A hotel clerk in Traverse City insisted he'd checked in a young woman matching Sarah's description, though the registration record showed a completely different name and the security cameras had been broken for weeks. Each tip required investigation. Each investigation consumed precious resources, and each dead end pushed Sarah's case further toward the growing pile of unsolved files in Morrison's office. By summer 2003, the investigation had expanded beyond Michigan's borders. Reports trickled in from Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Illinois, sightings of young Asian women who might be Sarah Chen, living under assumed names, working cash jobs, staying one step ahead of detection. Morrison dutifully followed each lead, driving thousands of miles and conducting hundreds of interviews with people who ultimately had nothing to do with Sarah's disappearance. The investigation consumed his patrol budget and strained relationships with neighboring law enforcement agencies, who grew tired of wild goose chases that yielded nothing but wasted time. The most promising lead came in August, when a social worker in Chicago contacted the Gratiot County Sheriff's Department about a client who'd enrolled in a homeless services program using identification that appeared fraudulent. The woman claimed to be from Michigan, had visible nursing skills when helping other clients with medical issues, and seemed terrified whenever anyone asked about her past. Morrison and Linda made the 6-hour drive to Chicago only to discover that the woman was actually Elena Vasquez, an undocumented immigrant from El Salvador who'd purchased fake identification to escape an abusive relationship. Elena's fear wasn't about a mysterious disappearance from a locked house. It was about deportation and returning to a man who'd hospitalized her twice. The psychological toll of false leads began to fracture the investigation team. Morrison, accustomed to cases that resolved within weeks or months, found himself questioning his abilities and his department's resources. He began avoiding Linda Chen's daily phone calls, dreading the hope in her voice when she asked about new developments. The state police gradually reduced their involvement, reassigning personnel to cases with more promising prospects. Search volunteers dwindled as autumn arrived and then winter returned, marking Sarah's first anniversary of disappearance with no new evidence, no viable suspects, and no answers. Derek Martinez became the investigation's most persistent dead end. Morrison interviewed him 17 times over the first year, approaching their conversations from different angles, hoping to catch inconsistencies or admissions. Derek's story never changed. He'd waited for Sarah to return from Mrs. Vance's house, grown worried when she didn't come back, discovered the house was locked and empty, and called police immediately. Polygraph tests proved inconclusive, neither clearing nor implicating him. His alibi for the 47 minutes of Sarah's disappearance remained what it had always been. He was alone in the house, waiting. In a case built on impossibilities, Derek's loneliness during those crucial minutes became both his strongest defense and his greatest vulnerability. By February 2004, exactly 1 year after Sarah's disappearance, her case had been quietly reclassified as a cold case. The active investigation was suspended, though Morrison assured Linda that any new evidence would receive immediate attention. The promise felt hollow to everyone involved, including Morrison himself, who knew that cold cases in rural Michigan often stayed cold forever, buried beneath accumulating paperwork and newer emergencies that demanded immediate resources. Detective James "Jimmy" Sullivan hadn't intended to inherit Sarah Chen's case. When he transferred to the Gratiot County Sheriff's Department in September 2005, 2.5 years after Sarah's disappearance, he was looking for the quieter pace that rural policing promised after 15 years with the Michigan State Police. Sullivan had worked major crime scenes, supervised multi-jurisdictional task forces, and testified in capital murder trials. At 42, with 2 failed marriages behind him and a drinking problem he'd recently conquered, he wanted cases involving stolen farm equipment and domestic disputes, not mysteries that consumed careers and destroyed personal lives. But Sarah Chen's file drew him back repeatedly during his first weeks on the job. Morrison had left behind meticulously organized evidence boxes, interview transcripts, and photograph albums, all stored in the basement evidence room like artifacts from an archaeological dig. Sullivan told himself he was simply familiarizing himself with the department's major unsolved cases, performing due diligence that any competent detective would undertake. Yet he found himself staying late, reading witness statements by the harsh fluorescent lights, studying crime scene photographs until the details were burned into his memory like religious iconography. The impossibility of Sarah's disappearance violated everything Sullivan understood about criminal investigation. People didn't vanish from locked houses without leaving trace evidence. Young women didn't disappear during blizzards without someone seeing or hearing something unusual. Cases didn't remain completely devoid of viable suspects or logical explanations after years of competent police work. Sullivan had solved murders where the only evidence was a single hair fiber and had tracked down suspects using nothing but witness descriptions of unusual mannerisms, but Sarah Chen's case offered none of the forensic breadcrumbs that usually led investigators from crime scene to courtroom. Sullivan's obsession began innocuously enough. He started by re-interviewing key witnesses, telling himself he was simply updating their statements and checking for details that might have been overlooked. Mrs. Vance, now in her 70s and increasingly frail, repeated her story exactly as she'd told it dozens of times before. Derek Martinez, who'd moved back to Grand Rapids and found work as an automotive technician, answered Sullivan's questions with the weary patience of someone who'd long since stopped expecting to be believed. Linda Chen, who'd exhausted her savings and moved back to Lansing, greeted Sullivan's renewed interest with desperate hope, tempered by years of disappointment. The detective's personal life began to reflect his professional preoccupation. Sullivan's modest rental house in nearby Ithaca became a secondary crime scene, its spare bedroom converted into an unofficial investigation headquarters. He tacked crime scene photographs to the walls, spread timeline charts across a folding table purchased from a garage sale, and filled filing cabinets with copies of evidence reports that he read and reread until the pages grew soft from handling. His refrigerator contained more takeout containers than fresh food, and his sleep became fragmented by dreams filled with footprints that ended in unmarked snow. Sullivan's colleagues began to notice his fixation. Sheriff Patricia Hayes, who'd hired him specifically for his experience with complex cases, initially encouraged his fresh perspective on the Chen investigation. But as months passed and Sullivan's attention to other cases suffered, she grew concerned about his mental health and professional effectiveness. Sullivan missed court dates because he was re-examining evidence. He arrived late for shifts after spending nights driving the rural roads around Millbrook, looking for details that previous investigators might have missed. His reports on routine cases grew perfunctory, while his Sarah Chen files expanded exponentially. The detective's breakthrough, or breakdown depending on perspective, came during a January 2007 snowstorm that reminded him of the night Sarah disappeared. Sullivan had been examining the original crime scene photographs for what felt like the 1,000th time when something about the snow patterns finally clicked. The accumulation around Sarah's rental house wasn't random. It showed subtle signs of disturbance that the 2003 investigators had dismissed as wind effects. Sullivan spent the next 6 hours measuring angles and calculating wind speeds from Weather Service archives, eventually convincing himself that someone had deliberately altered the snow to obscure evidence. When Sullivan presented his theory to Sheriff Hayes, complete with meteorological charts and geometric calculations, she realized that Sarah Chen's case had claimed another victim. The detective who'd transferred to Gratiot County seeking peace had instead found a mystery that was slowly destroying his objectivity and his career. Hayes faced an impossible choice: remove Sullivan from the case he'd made his life's work, or watch a competent investigator disappear down the same rabbit hole that had frustrated Morrison and heartbroken Linda Chen. Sarah's case, it seemed, had the power to consume anyone who stared too deeply into its void, transforming rational professionals into obsessed seekers chasing shadows through endless Michigan winters. Sullivan's investigation had reached the same dead end that had claimed Morrison, but his refusal to accept defeat would prove to be exactly what Sarah Chen's case needed, though neither he nor anyone else could have predicted the path that obsession would eventually illuminate. Detective Jimmy Sullivan's salvation came in the form of a phone call from the Michigan State Police Laboratory on March 15, 2019, 16 years after Sarah Chen's disappearance, and 12 years after Sullivan's obsession with her case had nearly cost him his career. Dr. Angela Martinez, a forensic DNA analyst, who'd never heard of Millbrook or Gratiot County, was calling about evidence samples that had been sitting in frozen storage since 2003, waiting for technology that hadn't existed when they were first collected. The samples consisted of fabric fibers recovered from Sarah's red winter coat, which had been found hanging in her bedroom closet the morning after her disappearance. Original testing in 2003 had identified the fibers as cotton blend, likely from another person's clothing, but DNA extraction technology at the time couldn't produce a usable profile from such minimal material. The fibers had been catalogued, stored, and essentially forgotten until Dr. Martinez's team began working through a backlog of cold case evidence using enhanced extraction techniques that could isolate genetic material from increasingly smaller samples. Sullivan, now 56 years old and serving as the department's senior detective, had weathered the years of frustration better than anyone expected. Sheriff Hayes had ultimately decided to let him pursue Sarah's case as a secondary assignment, reasoning that his expertise was too valuable to waste and his obsession too deep to cure through reassignment. Sullivan had solved dozens of other cases during the intervening years, but Sarah Chen remained the investigation that defined his career and haunted his dreams. When Dr. Martinez called, Sullivan was reviewing financial records from a recent embezzlement case, his mind occupied with mundane details about missing petty cash and altered receipts. The DNA profile recovered from the fabric fibers was partial but significant, 13 genetic markers that would be sufficient to identify a suspect if they had a sample for comparison. More importantly, the profile was male, which eliminated several theories that investigators had pursued over the years. Dr. Martinez explained that the enhanced testing had also revealed trace amounts of an unusual soap residue on the fibers, a commercial-grade cleanser typically used in institutional settings like hospitals, schools, or government buildings. The combination of DNA evidence and chemical analysis provided the first concrete leads in Sarah's case since the initial crime scene investigation. Sullivan's hands shook as he wrote down Dr. Martinez's findings, his careful notes betraying the excitement he tried to keep from his voice. After 16 years of dead ends and false leads, science was finally offering answers to questions that had consumed his professional life. The DNA profile would be entered into the combined DNA index system, where it would be compared against millions of samples from convicted criminals, crime scene evidence, and voluntary submissions. But Sullivan knew that CODIS matches were rare in cold cases, and he began planning his own systematic approach to identifying the source of the mysterious DNA. The detectives' renewed investigation focused on people who'd had access to Sarah during her final weeks, particularly those who worked in institutional settings that would explain the commercial soap residue. Sarah's nursing rotations had placed her in contact with dozens of hospital staff members, maintenance workers, and security personnel. Her part-time job at a medical supply company had involved interactions with delivery drivers, warehouse employees, and administrative staff. Each contact represented a potential source for the DNA sample, but tracking down individuals from 16 years earlier proved nearly impossible. People had died, moved away, or simply disappeared into lives that left no forwarding addresses. Sullivan's breakthrough came when he decided to expand his search beyond Sarah's known associates to include anyone who'd been questioned during the original investigation. He spent weeks digitizing old interview files, creating a database of everyone who'd provided statements or been considered as potential witnesses. The list included neighbors, co-workers, classmates, and dozens of people who'd simply been in the wrong place at the right time to draw police attention. Cross-referencing this list against employment records from institutions using commercial-grade cleansers produced 13 possible matches. The process of collecting DNA samples from potential suspects required delicate negotiation between constitutional rights and investigative necessity. Sullivan couldn't simply demand genetic samples from people who hadn't been charged with crimes, but he could request voluntary submissions and collect discarded materials that suspects left in public places. The work was tedious and often felt like an invasion of privacy that yielded no results. 8 of the 13 potential matches provided voluntary DNA samples that were quickly eliminated through laboratory comparison. 3 others proved impossible to locate or contact. The 13th name on Sullivan's list belonged to someone he'd never considered as a suspect, someone whose connection to Sarah seemed so peripheral that their DNA sample had been collected almost as an afterthought. When the laboratory called with the results of that comparison, Dr. Martinez's voice carried an excitement that matched Sullivan's own growing anticipation. The DNA profile was a perfect match. All 13 genetic markers aligned with the evidence recovered from Sarah's coat. After 16 years of questions without answers, science had finally identified the person who'd been in physical contact with Sarah Chen during her final hours. The revelation would shatter everything the community believed about the night she disappeared. But first, Sullivan had to confront the implications of what the DNA evidence actually meant. The name that appeared on Detective Sullivan's computer screen at 2:47 p.m. on April 3, 2019, belonged to someone who'd lived in plain sight for 16 years, someone who'd attended Sarah Chen's memorial service, someone who'd expressed sympathy to Linda Chen and offered assistance during the early days of the investigation. Robert Bob Vance, Mrs. Eleanor Vance's 68-year-old nephew, had been questioned briefly in 2003 as part of the routine canvass of Sarah's neighborhood. But his alibi had seemed ironclad, and his demeanor had raised no suspicions. Sullivan stared at the DNA match confirmation until the letters blurred together, his mind struggling to reconcile this revelation with everything he thought he knew about Sarah's case. Bob Vance worked as a maintenance supervisor at the Gratiot County Medical Center, which explained the commercial-grade soap residue found on the fabric fibers. He lived just 3 miles from Sarah's rental house and had unrestricted access to his aunt's property, including the spare key she kept hidden under her back porch flower pot. More disturbing still, Bob had been present in Mrs. Vance's kitchen on the evening of February 14, 2003, ostensibly helping his elderly aunt prepare for the blizzard by bringing her groceries and checking her heating system. The detective's review of the original case files revealed details that had seemed innocuous in 2003, but now carried sinister implications. Mrs. Vance had mentioned that Bob was always so thoughtful, arriving unannounced to help with household tasks and staying late to ensure she was comfortable during harsh weather. Bob had volunteered to join early search parties, spending hours trudging through snow-covered fields and abandoned buildings, ostensibly looking for Sarah while knowing exactly where she wouldn't be found. He'd even provided comfort to Derek Martinez during those first desperate weeks, sharing coffee and offering the kind of male support that Derek's friends and family struggled to provide. Sullivan's investigation into Bob Vance's background revealed a carefully constructed facade that had fooled everyone, including trained law enforcement personnel. Bob was known throughout Millbrook as a reliable handyman who helped elderly residents with home repairs, a church usher who never missed Sunday service, and a devoted nephew who'd cared for his aunt since his uncle's death in 1998. His employment record at the medical center showed exemplary performance over 23 years, with supervisors describing him as dependable, quiet, and respected by staff and patients alike. Bob's only criminal history consisted of a single speeding ticket from 1995 and a minor citation for burning leaves without a permit in 2001. But deeper investigation revealed disturbing patterns that had been invisible to casual observers. Hospital staff members, when questioned carefully, admitted that Bob had shown unusual interest in young female employees, particularly nursing students who rotated through various departments. Several women recalled conversations where Bob had asked personal questions about their schedules, living arrangements, and transportation habits. Most had dismissed his curiosity as awkward attempts at friendliness from a lonely older man, But in the context of Sarah's disappearance, his behavior took on a more predatory character. Sullivan discovered that Bob's access to the medical center's facilities extended far beyond normal working hours. His maintenance position required him to respond to emergency calls, giving him legitimate reasons to be in the building during evenings, weekends, and holidays. Security camera footage from 2003 had been routinely destroyed years earlier, but employment records showed that Bob had worked late shifts during January and February 2003, including the evening of Sarah's disappearance. Hospital policy allowed maintenance staff to use facility vehicles for emergency calls, providing Bob with transportation that wouldn't have been tracked or questioned during a blizzard. The most chilling discovery came when Sullivan examined Bob's relationship with his aunt more closely. Mrs. Vance, now 86 years old and suffering from early-stage dementia, had always portrayed her nephew as her protector and closest family member. But nursing home staff, where she'd lived since 2017, reported that Mrs. Vance sometimes became agitated when discussing her nephew, muttering about secrets and things Bob made me promise not to tell. Her condition made her an unreliable witness, but Sullivan wondered what truths might be trapped behind her deteriorating memory. Sullivan spent sleepless nights reconstructing what might have happened on February 14, 2003. Bob Vance could have been at his aunt's house when Sarah arrived to return the borrowed mug. He might have offered to walk her home through the blizzard, using his position as Mrs. Vance's trusted nephew to gain Sarah's confidence. With access to his aunt's spare key, Bob could have followed Sarah into her house, confronted her there, and then staged the scene to make her disappearance appear impossible. The locked doors and undisturbed snow were not evidence of supernatural intervention, but proof of someone who knew exactly how to manipulate a crime scene to confuse investigators. The DNA evidence provided the crucial link between Bob Vance and Sarah Chen, but proving what had happened during those 47 minutes required more than genetic markers. Sullivan needed to find Sarah's body, uncover additional evidence of Bob's involvement, and build a case strong enough to convince a prosecutor to file charges 16 years after the fact. The investigation that had consumed his career was finally approaching its conclusion, but the most difficult work still lay ahead. Detective Sullivan's surveillance of Robert Vance began on April 8, 2019, 5 days after the DNA match confirmation arrived from the state laboratory. Sullivan parked his unmarked sedan across the street from Bob's modest two-bedroom house on Maple Street, watching through binoculars as the 68-year-old man maintained the same routine he'd followed for decades. Bob left for work at the medical center at 6:45 a.m., returned home at 3:30 p.m., and spent his evenings watching television through windows that never quite closed their curtains completely. To neighbors and co-workers, Bob appeared unchanged, still the quiet, reliable handyman who'd lived in Millbrook since childhood. But Sullivan noticed details that spoke to a man under enormous psychological pressure. Bob's hands shook when he unlocked his front door each evening, fumbling with keys that he'd handled thousands of times before. His garbage bins, previously organized with military precision, now overflowed with empty whiskey bottles and takeout containers from restaurants he'd never patronized during Sullivan's earlier surveillance attempts. Most telling were Bob's visits to his aunt's grave at Millbrook Cemetery, a ritual that had increased from weekly to daily since the DNA results arrived. Sullivan watched through telephoto lenses as Bob knelt beside Mrs. Vance's headstone, his lips moving in conversations that no one else could hear, his shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to emerge from decades of buried guilt. The detective's confrontation strategy required delicate timing. Direct accusation without sufficient evidence might prompt Bob to destroy remaining proof or flee the jurisdiction. But allowing him to continue his normal routine risked additional psychological deterioration that might render him incapable of providing coherent testimony about Sarah's fate. Sullivan decided to apply gradually increasing pressure, beginning with seemingly routine follow-up questions about the original investigation and slowly building toward revelation of the DNA evidence. Sullivan's first formal interview with Bob took place at the medical center on April 15th, ostensibly as part of a cold case review that was examining all evidence and witness statements from 2003. Bob agreed to the interview with apparent cooperation, settling into his supervisor's office with the same calm demeanor he'd displayed 16 years earlier. But Sullivan noticed immediate signs of stress that hadn't been present during their previous interactions. Bob's breathing was shallow and rapid. His hands remained clasped tightly in his lap to control their trembling, and his eyes darted repeatedly toward the office door, as if calculating escape routes. When Sullivan mentioned that new forensic techniques had been applied to evidence from Sarah's case, Bob's composure began fragmenting in ways that were almost imperceptible but unmistakable to an experienced interrogator. His voice, previously steady and cooperative, developed a slight quaver when discussing his activities on February 14, 2003. His recollection of details, once precise and consistent, became fuzzy and contradictory. Most significantly, Bob volunteered information that hadn't been requested, offering explanations for circumstances that Sullivan hadn't yet questioned, the behavior of a guilty conscience attempting to stay ahead of inevitable revelation. The psychological pressure intensified during Sullivan's second interview 3 days later, when the detective revealed that DNA evidence had been recovered from fabric fibers found on Sarah's clothing. Bob's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face drained of color, his hands began trembling uncontrollably, and he excused himself to use the restroom, where Sullivan could hear him vomiting through the thin walls. When Bob returned, his carefully constructed facade was cracking visibly, revealing glimpses of the torment he'd carried for 16 years. Sullivan's breakthrough came during the third interview on April 22nd, when he informed Bob that the DNA profile had produced a match. The detective didn't immediately identify Bob as that match, instead watching as the 68-year-old man's psychological defenses finally collapsed completely. Bob's breathing became labored. His skin took on a grayish pallor, and his entire body began shaking as if he was experiencing a seizure. But instead of denial or demands for legal representation, Bob whispered words that Sullivan had been waiting 16 years to hear. "I never meant for it to happen the way it did. Sarah was such a sweet girl. She didn't deserve what I did to her." The confession that followed was fragmented and emotional, punctuated by sobs and long periods of silence, as Bob struggled to articulate actions he'd kept secret for more than half his life. But gradually, piece by piece, the truth about February 14, 2003 began emerging from the psychological wreckage of a man who could no longer carry the weight of his crime. The arrest of Robert Vance on April 24, 2019, shattered Millbrook's carefully maintained equilibrium like a stone thrown through stained glass. Sheriff Hayes had coordinated with the prosecutor's office to ensure that formal charges would be filed immediately after Bob's confession, but nothing could have prepared the community for the psychological earthquake that followed the revelation that Sarah Chen's killer had been living among them for 16 years, offering comfort to her grieving mother and participating in search parties for a young woman he'd already murdered. Linda Chen received the news at her apartment in Lansing, where she'd been preparing for another day at the factory where she'd worked since exhausting her savings during the early years of Sarah's disappearance. Detective Sullivan called her at 6:30 a.m., his voice heavy with emotions he'd learned to suppress during decades of law enforcement work. Linda's first reaction was silence so complete that Sullivan initially thought the call had been disconnected. When she finally spoke, her words came in fragments, questions about evidence and DNA and whether Sarah's body had been recovered, interspersed with sobs that seemed to emerge from some place deeper than grief. A region of maternal anguish that had been frozen for 16 years and was now thawing with devastating intensity. Bob's confession had provided crucial details about Sarah's final moments, but his psychological breakdown made it impossible to determine which elements represented accurate memory and which were products of guilt-induced fantasy. He claimed that he'd followed Sarah from his aunt's house on the pretext of helping her navigate the blizzard, that he'd used Mrs. Vance's spare key to enter Sarah's rental house, and that he'd confronted her with sexual intentions that she'd rejected. The physical struggle that followed had ended when Sarah struck her head against the kitchen counter, an injury that Bob insisted was accidental, but which proved fatal within minutes. According to Bob's fragmented account, he'd spent hours in Sarah's house deciding what to do with her body, eventually loading her into his medical center maintenance truck and driving to a location he described only as where she could rest peacefully. Now, his efforts to stage the scene had included locking all doors from inside before exiting through a basement window, then carefully obscuring his own tracks in the snow while preserving Sarah's footprints to create the impression that she'd vanished impossibly. The deception had required intimate knowledge of crime scene investigation, which Bob had acquired through years of watching forensic television shows and reading true crime books, an irony that wasn't lost on investigators who'd been mystified by the scene's apparent impossibility. The community's reaction to Bob's arrest revealed fault lines that had remained hidden for decades. People who'd known Bob since childhood struggled to reconcile the helpful handyman with the calculated killer described in police reports. Mrs. Patterson, whose late husband Earl had always distrusted Bob, told anyone who would listen that she'd sensed something wrong about him for years. But others, particularly elderly residents who'd relied on Bob's assistance with home repairs and maintenance, felt betrayed by their own judgment and questioned whether they'd ever really known anyone in their small town. Derek Martinez, now 39 years old and remarried with 2 children, learned about Bob's arrest through a phone call from his sister, who'd seen the news report on television. Derek's reaction combined relief, vindication, and a profound sadness that had nothing to do with Bob's guilt. For 16 years, Derek had lived under a cloud of suspicion, knowing that many people believed he was responsible for Sarah's disappearance, despite his consistent denials and cooperation with investigators. Bob's arrest finally cleared Derek's name, but it couldn't restore the years he'd lost to accusation and doubt, or the relationships that had been damaged by persistent whispers about his possible involvement. The investigation into Sarah's final resting place became Sullivan's most urgent priority, but Bob's mental state made it difficult to extract reliable information about the location where he'd disposed of her body. His confession contained references to peaceful water, and where the old oak watches over everything, descriptions that could apply to dozens of locations within the rural county. Search teams equipped with ground-penetrating radar began systematic examination of areas that matched Bob's vague descriptions, while Sullivan continued interviewing him in hopes of obtaining more specific details about Sarah's burial site. The case that had defined Sullivan's career was finally approaching resolution, but the detective found little satisfaction in solving a mystery that had cost so many people so much over the course of 16 years. Sarah Chen was still missing. Her family was still shattered by grief, and a community was still struggling to understand how evil could hide so effectively behind a facade of helpfulness and reliability. Bob Vance's arrest marked the end of the investigation, but it was only the beginning of a healing process that might take another 16 years to complete, if it could be completed at all.